You're listening to the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. Thanks for joining us once again for a new episode this week.
Yeah, and it's raining again. Who would have known? More rain.
Yeah, I was saying it feels like it's not the right season for rain, but apparently it is.
Well, it happens sometimes, not a lot, but we had one of those weeks where it was going to be the most crazy busy week, and then this seems to always happen whenever we have too many things booked. It rains and everything gets cancelled, and suddenly we're home free.
It works out well for us, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, things are postponed, so it'll all be on. It's just postponed for now. But yeah, let's dive into today's topic. What are we talking about?
Well, we had a little discussion recently about an author who had just written a book talking about how technology, our mobile phones, access to the internet, all that sort of stuff is actually starting to make an impact on our relationship with God, because it's always before us. It's always stimulating us. It's always something to look at. Something's dinging. Something's buzzing in your pocket, and you're checking it, whether it's checking the news, checking social media, checking email. But it's just almost like this nagging distraction of life that it's always there.
Yeah, there's always distractions that we can either let them consume us, or we can choose a different way, a way of, an intentional way of living.
Yeah, but I thought it was just a really interesting observation, and it got me thinking, because you may not know this, but I'm a bit of a people watcher, particularly when I'm out in public. I am very focused on people, and I watch people, and I watch how they behave and how they walk, and I always notice anything that's different or out of place or whatever. But as I live my life now, I notice wherever I go, if someone is sitting down for more than 2 seconds, they are looking at a phone.
Yeah. It didn't used to be that way. Of course, we didn't have smartphones. Smartphones are a reasonably new thing, really. I mean, we're not that old. I guess we're getting older. But when we were young, there were phones that hung on the kitchen wall. And we didn't have computers even, not until my family got one when I was about 16, I think. And so there weren't computers really. There were video games, but my family didn't have them. We had a TV, but for most of my childhood, we didn't have a TV. And then when we did get one, it was black and white, and we were behind the times. I mean, other people had televisions, but I lived on a farm. We spent most of our time outdoors. That was kind of the lifestyle that we had. And now living in the city, raising children, I really struggle with this. It's what do you do with your kids, especially now they're getting into the teenage years, the temptation of this constant presence of screens is just everywhere. It's all around us.
Yeah, well, I am old enough that I don't think I had a mobile phone until at least my mid-20s. I know I was already out of college by that point.
Same.
And did not have a phone like that until maybe 26, 7 years old, something like that.
Yeah.
It was not something that was around. And so I'm old enough to remember the good old days before that. And
yeah, how on earth did we get anywhere?
I know. I have to say, probably my favorite function of a mobile phone is the GPS.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. And
it is very helpful. I used to drive around in my little old car with a map book. We call them Refidexes in Australia, with a Refidex open in my lap while driving. So that wasn't probably the safest way to drive.
And I don't really know how I found anything, because you'd have to get directions from somebody, and it would be like third red light on the turn left. And
it's the worst in the US, because then they tell you to go north or south. And I'm like looking at the sun, trying to figure out what they're talking about.
Yeah, you needed a compass and all. But yeah, things have changed a lot. And this is not an episode to put down technology and say it's bad or evil or anything like that. But I do think it's a relevant conversation to have, just to think about the time and energy that we spend on our phones. Now, I'm as guilty as the next person. I try to be disciplined about it. There are times, as I say, I very intentionally have nothing to do, and I will not pick up my phone. Now, and just intentionally be bored, or intentionally look around my environment, pay attention. Like if I'm waiting on somebody at the mall, I'll just sit down and watch people, as opposed to looking at my phone and
Yeah, I think we waste a lot of time, but also it's really tempting for people to do work wherever you are. So I know for me, I might be waiting at ballet to pick our daughter up and think, oh, I could quickly do some social media posts, or I could, jot something down, or I could brainstorm something, or I could send an email. And so you're kind of always on the clock almost.
You never get a break. Like there's never that break from people being able to contact you. I think that's one of the biggest things. People can contact us 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world, and about 100 different versions of that, whether it's messaging or social media, the telephone, email, all that stuff. We're just never able to switch off.
Yeah, we're always contactable.
I was reading a few stats on mobile phones, and here in Australia, apparently 95% of people have a mobile phone.
Ooh, who's the 5%?
I don't know.
Or maybe they're the little kids.
It would be, yes. I think it is children, but 40% of children have their own mobile phone at this point, and they're talking about age 6 to 14.
Yeah.
So there's not many of them without one.
I know. Well, it is very handy, honestly, especially when you have kids that catch buses or different things. You want to be able to call them and see how they are. So I understand it, but this is the problem that we face with raising children in this modern age, is that when you give them a screen, it's so addictive to them. It's so distracting. It gives them, we've talked about, dopamine and serotonin and all those sorts of good chemicals that the brain loves that bring us pleasure. We can get all of that from the constant stimulation from the screen. And that's what kids can't manage that or monitor that. They can't say, I think I've had enough of this for today. They just continue to look at it. They continue to scroll. They find things. We try to put all these restrictions on our kids' phones and different things, but they find ways around all of that. And they're very clever.
They're much smarter than we are.
Yeah, we don't think of all those things.
Well, here's some interesting stats. So 1 in 10 Australians find mobile phones annoying. 4 in 10 find them distracting. And 32% of smartphone users in Australia express that their use of mobile devices increases their stress and anxiety. So
makes sense.
And Vodafone apparently did a survey, and they found that 45% of the people surveyed said they could not live without their phone.
Oh, gosh.
So it's become something, it is literally strapped to your hip,
I mean, I do know that when we are out meeting people or picking up our kids or whatever, we rely a little too much on, I'm going to give them a call when I get there. And I had this happen the other day. When I got there, I called and my kid's phone was dead, the battery had died. And so then you're like, oh, now what do I do? We didn't organize this ahead of time.
I have to think back to the 1990s. What would they have done?
What would
back
I have
then?
done?
Yes,
what would 1990s me do?
Exactly. But, that's interesting to see that 32%, so almost a third of people using the phone say that it causes them stress and anxiety.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
So that's a negative thing. And as I was saying, just having it in your hand and never giving your brain, we talked about this the other day, never giving your brain a rest.
Yeah, or your eyes.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of side effects to having technology so readily available.
And it's impacting all of us, but I particularly worry about the youngest generation who are not used to anything else. This is all they know. I think it would be really hard for them to even comprehend any other kind of reality, whereas for us it's all, we're used to not having it. But I think that it's developing their brains in a completely different way than how our brains were developed at that age, and it's concerning.
Well, and even I went to a physio a while back, and they were talking about how many 13-year-olds they're seeing with neck problems because they're in that head down looking at a mobile phone all the time, that it's even affecting posture and muscles and bones and growth and development and all that. Now, talking about all that, so there's a lot of positive with mobile phones.
Sure.
We've talked about a lot of practical negatives like the stress and anxiety, maybe overstimulation, not having rest, all that kind of stuff. But as a Christian, is there a spiritual consequence to using mobile phones? And that's really what I want to dig into today is, are they actually impacting us as Christians in our Christian walk and our intimacy and time spent with God?
Yeah.
Now, I don't have stats for this, but I could pretty well say that most Christians spend more time on their phone than they do praying or reading the word or worshiping or anything else.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And I mean, I can only speak from my own experience and our experience, which is that I certainly feel very distracted and as though I don't have lots of time when my brain is just resting and listening for God.
And the Bible, makes it pretty clear that we need to spend a regular time with God. Like we need to set aside time to be in his presence. And if Jesus is our example and we're supposed to follow Jesus's example as believers, there's multiple passages talking about him rising early in the morning, going off by himself, where he would spend time with God in prayer and worship and listening and rest with God. Yeah. And I've often said, the verse where he says, I only do what I see and hear the Father saying and doing, that part. I think the reason he was so effective, I mean, yes, he was Jesus, but the reason he was so effective in ministry is because I think he'd already spent time with the Father that day. And again, this is just my idea, my opinion, but I think God told him, you're going to go by this pool today and there's going to be a crippled man. You're to heal him.
Yeah.
I think he knew those things.
It's possible, for sure.
Because he'd already spent time with God. So he knew what the agenda was. He knew that God was going to work through him in certain ways. Or
even if he didn't tell him ahead of time, which he would have, because it's Jesus. But I'm talking about for us, how can we, follow in Jesus' footsteps, even if God doesn't tell us ahead of time, this is what's going to happen. Forming that connection early in the day where you're giving your day to God and you're connecting with Jesus and you're talking to him, you're listening to his voice, that sets you up for the rest of the day so that when you do see the person that you need to pray for or that needs healing or whatever, you're listening to the prompting of God. Spirit, he says, pray for that person. You're there. You're listening. You're connected.
Well, we're part of the prophetic ministry at our church, and we teach people often how to hear God's voice. I've written a book on hearing God's voice. And one of the keys is you have to listen. And to listen is not just with your ears, we've been married a long time and I can listen to you and do 3 other things at the same time, but I'm not really listening. You know what I mean?
Not taking it in, processing it. Yeah.
I hear your voice and I understand the words, but I may not necessarily be acknowledging it and processing it, as you say, and replying in the ways that you would like for me to. So listening actually takes some intentionality. And if we're going to hear God's voice, everybody would probably agree and say, I want to hear God's voice more clearly. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to spend time listening.
Yeah.
In Psalm 46:10, it says, be still and know that I'm God. It's such a simple passage. Everybody's probably heard that quoted at some point.
Yeah.
But there's 2 things.
Or knows the song, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But there's 2 things there. You've got to first still yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really hard for us in our culture today, is to be still, to sit quietly, to stop checking your phone, to stop, worrying about what's coming up next and what have I got to do next and whatever else. I remember when I was working back at the church, we would have staff prayer days. And sometimes I would take everybody's mobile phones and we'd put them in a basket and put them in a completely different room. And we would do exercises forcing us to just be still.
Yeah. And it's really hard.
Really hard.
Raising teenagers in this culture, one of the things that I've noticed is that they struggle with that so hard, to sit still, to be still, to have nothing to do. That's really difficult for them, especially we didn't have this in our car growing up, where you're driving and there's a DVD player going all the time. We didn't have that. But a lot of families had DVD players in the back of their car. So even when they were sitting in traffic, their kids weren't bored.
Yeah, I know. This is the thing. They've had look, technology is a terrific babysitter. I understand why people use it, and I'm not criticizing it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of screaming in the back of our car.
We have, but that was just mainly because we were too poor to have cool stuff like that in our car.
Yeah,
but
we got the basic car.
Yeah, but I understand it because it keeps them quiet. They're not asking you 1,000 questions. They're not bored. They're not getting in trouble. That they're just there and quiet, you've handled it. But yet what is the damage we're doing? And that's not really the topic of today's show, but I want to talk about even throughout your day. So it's great. Let's start. I'm sure there's plenty of people listening that you start your day and you have a quiet time and you spend time with God and all of that. But even throughout the day, I think these phones have become such a distraction, because I watch, if anybody has more than about 2 seconds of free time, that phone is in their hands looking at something.
Yeah, it's true.
Whether it's the weather or the news, or they're checking an email, or it's beeped because somebody texted them, or whatever. Nobody sits still. Nobody takes a break from it.
Yeah.
How are you going to hear God? Like oftentimes, as you say, God speaks and he says he has a quiet, small voice, right? A still, small voice.
Yeah.
If we're not listening, like I was saying before, if I'm not really listening intently, I can miss that. Like through the day, go speak to that woman, share this, do this. Yeah. It'll go right over our heads because we're checking Facebook.
I shared last week about my testimony, and one of the things that I talked about was when God spoke to me and told me to write, and that it was in a very loud voice. The reason I emphasize that is because that's not usually how I hear God. Only twice in my life have I ever heard what I would call kind of an audible voice. I don't know if it was, I don't know if anyone else would have heard it, but it was so loud that it sounded to me like an audible voice. That's twice in my whole life. The rest of the time, whenever I hear God, usually it is a very still, small voice. I've got to be paying attention and realize, oh, this is God. This is God coming through here. I don't always realize it, and sometimes I don't realize until later, because it might be a word of prophecy and then it happens and I think, oh, well, that was God, but I didn't realize at the time. So it really is something you have to be intentional about, but I'll share how I, in recent years or the last couple of decades, have heard from God is usually when I don't have anything else distracting me. So it's not usually always in my quiet time, or because I'm reading and I'm studying and I'm looking at the Bible and different things, and he'll speak to me through the Bible. But when he wants to tell me something, often when I'm not distracted, when I'm sitting in the car driving and my brain, all it has to do is think about driving, or when I'm doing the dishes and there's nothing else on, or when I'm going for a walk and I'm not listening to a podcast, which I usually do. So if I've got nothing else sort of coming into my ears or my eyes, no other inputs, that's when I usually hear God. That's when he usually tells me most of the things. And you know this because you see me come back from a walk all excited about all the things God's been telling me on my walk. And so sometimes I intentionally don't listen to a podcast, don't put the radio on in the car and those sorts of things, because I know I need to give my brain a rest so that God can get through.
Yeah, I'm similar. I probably, if I really want to hear God's voice, I tend to go drive, and I like to drive in the mountains. And I've been driving since I was 15, and it's like I switch off driving. I don't really have to think about it. And so I like to go drive into the mountains, and I'll either do a big long loop around, a scenic route or something like that, or I'll find a quiet place to pull over and I'll spend time just sitting at a picnic table and talking to God and listening to God and waiting on him. But that is when I most hear him. But that means I have to turn off the radio. The only sound that can be heard is just the rumbling of my big 4-wheel drive, and so that's when I feel like God talks to me the most, or the most clearly, I guess you would say, is when I pull myself out of the daily routine and the daily stuff and actually sit there and listen. But that, again, as I say, that takes discipline. It takes intentionality to do that. I can't go drive through the mountains every day. I have other things to do. Throughout my day, I guess I would like to challenge the listener. In this coming week, when you sit down and you have those few minutes spare, instead of picking up your phone, see what happens if you just leave it in your pocket and you listen for God's voice. Just see what a difference it makes. Now, I'm not talking about don't use your phone at all, but we all know those times, right? We sit down, maybe it's even eating lunch. You're going to stop and eat lunch, but you got your phone there and you're watching a YouTube clip or you're reading the news or whatever it may be. Just leave it in your pocket.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean don't think about anything, because you can think about things as long as you're leaving yourself open, giving that opening to God. And one of the things we did in 2020, I remember when we were doing a family trip, you and I sort of committed to spending a few minutes each day meditating because it's something we've never done before. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to meditate in a way that connected us to God so that we could listen. It's really just being quiet and being still. We call it meditation, but it was really just being quiet, being still, and leaving that space for God to kind of break through. And it never really took off with us. We just we did it a few times and then we just let go and didn't keep going with it. But that would be something that we should probably try again, is just, you only need to do a few minutes, but get into the habit of just quieting yourself, quieting your mind, quieting everything around you when you have those few minutes, maybe in the morning, and just spend that time waiting on God.
I think that's a brilliant idea. I mean, I guess I brought this topic up because I just wonder, how much are we missing? How much are we missing that God wants us to know, that God wants to say to us?
How often is he speaking and that we just don't hear him?
You know, is he being sort of muted by our technology? I mean, these are the questions that I've been pondering and thinking about. And so when you brought up that book and told me the topic, I just thought, well, that's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate and to start to think about how we use our smartphones and everything, all the technology that we have. Now, I know for a lot of us, we work in an office and you're stuck to the computer and you have to have your phone in case clients call and this and that. But I guarantee there are plenty of moments throughout a day that you can put it down and listen for God's voice. See, this is, I guess the point I'm sort of making is I think Jesus, he didn't just listen to the Father in those morning sessions when he went out by himself. I think he was always listening. I remember a quote from Smith Wigglesworth, and he said, "I never pray for more than 20 minutes very often, but I never
go 20 minutes without praying.
Never go 20 minutes without praying. Thank you." But, he says, I never pray that long when I pray, but I don't go very long without praying.
Yeah.
And, there are other figures from Christian history where people have tried to live a lifestyle of prayer and contemplation, of listening to God's voice, being in tune with him.
Yeah.
Like today we tend to kind of go, I'm going into that space. Like it's very compartmentalized. Like I'm over here doing this, but in a few minutes I'm going to go to church and then I'm going to be in that space. Whereas we compartmentalize it, where I think God really wants to, the verse, pray without ceasing. I'm sure you've heard.
That's what I was just going to say. How do you pray without ceasing if you have constant noise without ceasing?
Well, that's it. And obviously it does not mean that we're on our knees praying 24 hours a day. Nobody can do that. But it's like a conversation that has a pause. I think if you can think about it like that, we have conversations and sometimes there's a pause. Doesn't mean the conversation's over. It just means there's a break of silence in there.
And sometimes I'm good at this and sometimes I'm not. But the times when I am praying throughout the day, it's things like, what do you think about that, God? Or what should I do here? Or that's not really fair, God. I don't like that. Or, just telling him stuff throughout the day and asking him for his input. Or I might thank him for something that just happened. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you, God. How wonderful. And it's just little things throughout the day that you can say, that you can listen. And it's sort of an ongoing conversation with pauses.
Yeah. Well, I've been doing some teaching in primary school this week, and mine has been, help, God, please help me.
Rescue me.
Yes. Take this burden from me. No, they're very cute and sweet, but
the other thing I was thinking about was, to God, actually rest is really important, and so much so that it's one of the commandments that we're to have one whole day every week to rest and not work and not be distracted and not do anything else except just rest.
Yes, we sort of Western Christians, particularly in the church like Baptist church and all that, we don't really do the Sabbath very well.
No, we don't. We're terrible at it. And it's not because we're against it. It's just really hard to have a whole day where you sit and rest.
And you know what's funny? Like, you've known me my whole life. I hate taking naps during the day. I know some people are like, they just love to have a nap. I hate taking naps during the day. I always have. My mother even complains. I stopped taking naps when I was like 2 years old, and I never took naps ever since.
I blame you for our kids doing that.
So I hate naps. But on a Sunday, I tell you what, if there is a day where I need a nap or feel like having a nap, or if I ever do have the rare nap, it is on a Sunday.
Yeah, and Sundays I always feel really tired.
So,
but unfortunately, I always leave the laundry for Sunday and the baking and all these things. So
I know I always think you're crazy, but we do. I guess as a family, we do. Obviously, we go to church, and then sometimes we have our home group and stuff on Sunday. But it's a fairly relaxed day, more than the others.
Yeah, for everyone but me, it sure is.
Well, you set your own schedule. You can change it.
I've got to get better at this.
But, today, like I say, we don't have like a huge, deep conversation going about this, but I just wanted to sort of throw that out there as a thought-provoking topic to go, is this really robbing us of our intimacy and our ability to hear God because we're constantly glued to a phone or the internet?
Yeah, and think about what it's robbing from us, because intimacy with God brings joy and peace and hope and love and all these good things into our life, direction and purpose and opportunities and who knows what else. And we're being robbed of all of that. And we might be living a life where it feels like Groundhog Day every day. And where's the joy? Where's the hope? Why does nothing good ever happen? I'm not saying everything good will happen through intimacy with God, but you will have all the good things like love and hope and joy and peace, all of the fruit of the Spirit that God promises us that comes from connection with His Spirit.
It is. And I think about a lot of what's on our phone is in contrast to that. It's the news and all the bad stuff that's happening. Like you and I both like being on X, and we have a very, very different X profile, I guess.
Shout out to my X followers.
But like the stuff I follow and the stuff you follow are very, very different. But at the same time, there's not a lot of positivity on there.
Yeah, there's a lot of negativity, and it might be the people that are spending the most amount of time on those sort of platforms. Maybe it is impacting their mental health.
Well, I just mean even just the factual stuff. If you're just reading the news or you're hearing about some political problem.
The news, yeah. It's all very sensational and dramatic and negative. It's not positive.
And even me as a sports fan, I follow a lot of sports teams and different things. Like today's opening day of baseball season, I'm very excited, and my Atlanta Braves lost. So, that's sad. That's negative. And but I just think we're filling ourselves with stuff that does not bring those things that you were talking about, does not bring us peace, does not bring us joy, does not give us hope.
And even if we are, because I follow a lot of Christian things and listen to Christian podcasts and all that sort of stuff, that stuff is great. But if we're doing it all the time and not giving ourselves that space to be able to connect with God and hear from Him and listen to His voice and speak to Him, then it is robbing us, as you say, of that intimacy with Him, which is what brings all of the fruit and the gifts that are promised in the Bible into our lives.
So, I don't know. I hope at least today maybe you will think about putting your phone down a little more often.
Yeah, let's challenge everybody who's listening this week. Let's try to give some space each day to God, to rest in His presence and listen for His voice.
Yeah, in those moments where you don't have anything to do, listen for His voice as opposed to scrolling on your phone. I think that would be a really good challenge and a great exercise. Thank you so much for listening to the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. If you enjoyed the podcast today, please like, subscribe, leave us a comment. We have been reading those, and we thank you for sending those through. Share this with somebody that you think might need to hear it as well. This has been the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. Have a blessed day.